What's up, .NET developers? Do you want to build some applications but only focus on the source code that you're building and you don't know where to get started? We've taken a look and talked a little bit about Lambda, but what if we want to build a serverless application from scratch? So in this video, I'm going to talk about the Serverless Application Model, or SAM, right here on AWS for the .NET developer. Hey folks, Isaac Levin here with another edition of AWS for the .NET Developer, a place where we can learn about all sorts of cool things that AWS is providing to make the .NET developer's life a bit better. So we've already talked about AWS Lambda, so if you haven't seen that video, be sure to click on it and take a look and let me know what you think about it. But what if we want to take all of the resources needed as we define our serverless application and package them up and deploy them out at the same time and configure and manage them at the same time in a more organized fashion? We can use the Serverless Application Model, or SAM, to be able to do that. So let's take a look at what SAM is, and maybe the little bit of end will show a little bit of demo about how we can do better and build better, interesting serverless applications using SAM. So let's a little bit more detail about the AWS Serverless Application Model, or SAM for short. So what is the AWS Serverless Application Model, or SAM? So firstly, it's an open source declarative framework for building open source applications. So when you think of serverless functions, you think of Lambda. So it provides a CLI for easy local Lambda function creation, development, debugging, and deployment. One thing that's really, really great too about SAM is that you can model your environment with YAML syntax to express functions, APIs, or other resources like databases. This is great because you can define your entire serverless application in a way that you can check in the source code, share with other developers, and it provides just a more scalable way to be able to model your environments. You can use transforms and that expand the SAM syntax into AWS CloudFormation syntax. So for a little bit of context, AWS CloudFormation is the way that we define our infrastructure in AWS. So if you're creating a Lambda and an API gateway, maybe DynamoDB, all of that is actually configured and created and managed inside of CloudFormation. So this enables you to build serverless applications faster because it sits on top of CloudFormation. And how that is managed is that CloudFormation has this concept of stacks, which is a way that we organize groups of resources and services. So let's take a look at just a sample of what the configuration file for a SAM application is. So in this particular example here, as it's pretty straightforward, we have a set of resources and we have a function that defines a particular runtime. In this case, it's .NET 6. We have an IAM permission, identity access model permission, to be able to read a DynamoDB table. And we have an API endpoint called product/ID that's going to allow us to create a simple table. So that's going to let us manage the entire flow. So what this particular example does, it's going to get a set of products based on an ID that's passed in, and that's all defined right here in this fairly easy to read file. So let's take a look and think about how we can get started building serverless applications using the SAM CLI. So if you're just getting started, the first command that you're going to want to take a look at is SAM init. And what SAM init does is it generates a pre-configured AWS SAM template and example application in a language of your choice. So in our particular case, we're .NET developers. We can create a .NET 5, .NET 6, or .NET 7 AOT Lambda project from one of those templates. Then we could actually use SAM package, which bundles your application code and dependencies into a deployment package. So this is great if you want to have your artifacts saved off somewhere. You can also run SAM build, which prepares subsequent steps like deploy or local, which prepares it for those things. So, and then finally, after you've built your application, you can then deploy it to AWS Cloud straight away. So this is actually going to configure all the things. It's going to create that CloudFormation stack. It's going to provision those resources, and it's going to eventually deploy your built code. What SAM build does behind the scenes, just for a little bit of context, is it'll run, if you're familiar with .NET, it's going to run the .NET CLI publish command, which is going to provide our artifacts to deploy. But what if you want, before you use SAM deploy and get your application up to the cloud, maybe you want to test locally in your environment. You can use SAM local, which creates a test harness to be able to invoke your functions locally in your own environment. So here is kind of a typical workflow of testing locally with AWS SAM. So at the top level here, we have SAM local invoke, and what that's going to do is it's going to it's going to specify our function name and handler. It's going to specify the Lambda runtime that's emulated using Docker, so it creates a containerized version of the entire Lambda environment with your application in it. And then it's going to provide some invocation information. So most notably the log of that invocation, the report that comes with it, and then eventually the result. In this particular example, which is the hello world template example, the output or the result of a request is a message, which is hello world, and a location, which is an IP address of the client that's running on. So after we've actually gone through and done some local invocations of our application where we feel comfortable deploying to the cloud, we can then run SAM build. And like I mentioned earlier, it builds up that source code and packages it into a particular artifact that allows us to deploy it out. And then we can use the SAM deploy command to create that CloudFormation stack. And then it's what's great as well about the SAM CLI is that we can see all the resource creation update real time as we go through it. So let's actually take a look, a really quick demo of some of the different ways that we can use the SAM CLI to set up our .NET application and eventually deploy it to AWS Lambda. So let's look at a typical development workflow using the Serverless Application Model CLI or the SAM CLI. So right now I'm in my console and I already have the SAM CLI installed. So that's SAM dash dash version. As you can see, I have 1.78 of the SAM CLI. This recording is at the end of March, and that's the latest version. I also have the .NET SDK. So if I can do .NET info, as you can see here, I have a handful of versions of the .NET SDK. I have .NET 6, .NET 7, and the 7 that comes with preview. All right. So what I want to do, and I've already done kind of like the Hello World example in a previous video in the AWS Lambda video. So let's not do that. Let's do something different. But I'm still going to use the same approach. So I'm going to do SAM init. And it's going to walk me through, again, that guided process of setting up our serverless application project. So I'm going to go again with the AWS Quick Start template, and it's going to give me a list of options. So again, we've already done option 1. We did that in a previous video. Let's try something a bit more complex. So let's do the serverless API option. So option number 3. So at that particular time, it then says, what runtime would I like to use? I can use .NET 6, .NET Core 3.1, and some versions of Node. So I definitely want to use .NET 6. And then it's going to ask me some questions around observability and telemetry. So the first thing it's going to ask is if I want to enable X-ray tracing. So the ability to trace routes or trace activity from across all my serverless application. And I definitely want that. So yes. And the next thing is going to say if I want to add and monitoring for CloudWatch Application Insights. So telemetry for the actual AWS Lambda that's running behind the scenes. So I definitely want that. So yes. And then it's going to provide a project name. So let's just call it .NET SAM API. Right. So in this point in time, it's going to generate an application for us. And that application is using the .NET 6 runtime. The architecture is x64, and we have it. So then it provides some commands that we can use next. So we could either create a pipeline so we can then have a particular a workflow that we can do again and again. We can validate our SAM template. So if we need to make changes to it in the future, we can validate to make sure it's still valid SAM. Or we can test the function in the cloud using SAM sync. We can also deploy it using SAM guided and so on and so forth. So let's try this. So let's just do, the first thing we definitely want to do before, let's actually cd in before I do that. So, oops, wrong one, .NET SAM API. All right, so we're going to clear out our console. And then let's just do a SAM build. So, and talk a little bit about what SAM build actually does. So SAM build, it's going to call underneath the covers the .NET CLI, specifically the .NET publish command on the .NET CLI. And then it's going to take those published bits, those artifacts, and it's going to zip them up into a zip folder. That's because we selected the zip option earlier. If we would have selected the image option, it would have provided us with a Docker image that we could then use. So once this particular command is run, so it's running .NET CLI package, and then boom, as you can see here, a lot of stuff happened. So .NET publish, like I mentioned earlier, and then zipping up all of those DLLs and configuration files, and now we have a successful SAM package. And let's actually do this. Let's actually take a look at the structure of the folder that SAM init creates. So I'm going to open this up I'm inside the folder here, and let's just open up VS Code Insiders, and this is going to pop it open in a different window. So let me drag it over. So popping it open here. All right, so let's take a look at a few things. So the first thing that we want to take a look at is our sam config.toml. So this is a configuration file. Let's just get this out of the way. This here. And what this basically does is this provides the configuration for the deployment of our serverless application model. So we haven't deployed it yet, but when we actually go through the deployment process, this we can actually elect to have this file updated. But as you can see here, there's some settings that are provided for instance, starting Lambda, warming the containers, and those sort of things, resolving S3 and all that stuff. And we can actually take a look at this after we do a deployment to confirm those changes have been put in based on our particular deployment needs. We also have a template.yaml file, and this is the file that basically defines our serverless application. And let's take a look and see what some of these settings actually mean. So the first thing, let's just gives us a transform and a name. These are just some information about the template file itself. The big thing down here, we set up API tracing enabled, so that was from earlier when we selected Y on using X-Ray. And then if we go down here to the resources section, there's a handful of resources that have been created, and we can actually minimize them all and take a look at them each individually and see what's going on. So the first thing is it creates a .NET Code Web API serverless. So this is a simple example, includes a .NET Core API app with DynamoDB. So with the serverless application, serverless API template, it's a .NET 6 API, web API that's serverless that that allows you to basically do CRUD commands, create, read, update, and delete commands against a DynamoDB table. And DynamoDB is our key value pair document store in AWS. So it provides the path to the code URI. So that's src.net SAM API, the handler for that particular entry point, the runtime. We can then configure memory size if we want. And then there's some interesting stuff here because we start to provide some sample tables. So sample table here, this is the table that's defined down below. And then Dynamo CRUD policy. So we actually create an IAM policy, IAM, Identity Access Management, to be able to do CRUD commands against the sample table that we're going to create down below. And then we have a proxy resource because we have in front of our serverless API, we have API gateway to make sure that we're routing the traffic specifically. And we can specify the different methods we provide, the path, which is the proxy, and the payload format as well. So again, like we can then edit these if we want, and then if we wanted to edit these and make any changes, we could use SAM validate to make sure that everything is still correct. And then the next thing is this DynamoDB table. So when we actually create this, when we actually deploy the serverless application model, I'll talk about what deploy means in a second, it'll actually create a DynamoDB table for us as well. And there's one primary key on this table, and its name is ID, and the type of it is string. And the table name is going to be .NET SAM API book catalog. That's pretty cool. And then we have an application resource group, which allows us to identify the CloudFormation stack name and application insight. So when we want to set up CloudWatch to get that whole telemetry story for all of the things that are going on our serverless application, that's where this is configured. And then we have some additional things here as it pertains to being able to light up that monitoring individually. And then at the bottom, which I think is probably the most important point, is it's going to provide an output, which is the URL of our API. So that's really, really cool. And again, we can make modifications to all these things and then run that SAM validate command to ensure that it is still valid, it will deploy. So if we open this back up again, I have some configuration for OmniSharp as well. But then I have a couple of other folders. So I have a test folder. So the SAM template provides a test for us. So that's an XUnit. So as you can see here, it's a .NET 6 XUnit project. And there's some book controller and there's a mock book repo as well to be able to run those commands against there. So that's cool. And we're going to skip over SRC for just a second, but then we're going to take a look at some of the things that come for the ride when we actually build this. So when we actually build, when we run a SAM build, it generates that zip file, and then it stores that hash here. So every single time we do a SAM build, if there's been changes, this hash is going to update. So that's really, really valuable for us. So let's take a look at the source code. So as you can see, the source code, there's nothing really insane here. It is a .NET 6 Web API. The AWS project type is Lambda because we're still having it be serverless. And we're using DynamoDB, and we're using the Lambda ASP.NET Core hosting package as well. So inside of here, pretty simple stuff. So we're adding our controllers, JSON options. We're getting the AWS region, and then we're specifying the DynamoDB context, and a bunch of other things. And how this particular application works is we have a controller that's of a book type, so book controller. So when anybody hits the API/books endpoint, we're going to do some things. So we can actually get the list of books, we can get an individual book, we can post books and put books, and eventually delete books. So simple CRUD methods. And how this is actually done, and we're going to walk through the code just a little bit more, is it uses the repository pattern. So we have a book repository, which is a wrapper for our DynamoDB context. So creating, getting, editing, or updating, or putting, and then deleting. And so if you look at our entities here, this is the way that we identify the actual object that's stored in DynamoDB. So we're using the data annotations here for the DynamoDB table. So .NET SAM API book catalog, and then it specifies all of the properties that come along with it. So let's do this. So we can actually deploy this. So let's actually do that. So let's minimize this, and then let's just run a SAM deploy guided. And what this is going to do is it's going to walk through a guided process to actually take our serverless application and deploy it. So it's the first thing it's going to ask is for a stack name. So that stack name, .NET SAM API, that's fine. Going to specify a region, US West 2, which is in Portland, Oregon, so that's fine. And then it's going to say, do you want the resource changes to be deployed and require Y? So yes, I want those to be changed. Do I want to create a new SAM role for this particular, a new IAM role for this particular serverless application? Yes. Do I want to disable rollback? Sure, let's disable rollback because this is just like a quick demo. And then there's another interesting question where it says that our serverless application may not have authorization defined. So this is okay. So because it's an API, so it's accessible via the internet. So if we don't have authorization, anybody that can send a request to that endpoint, to that API, and API gateway can actually get data back. In this particular case, that's fine. And then it's going to ask it again because we have a couple of different endpoints on there. So let's just do Y is there. Then we can save our arguments to a configuration file. And then we can specify the SAM configuration file. So let's just have that be SAM configuration file environment. That's default. So that's the default credentials. And then what it's going to do is it's going to actually configure and define all the things that are going to be needed to be deployed. So let's actually take a look at that and have some context here. So when we create a serverless application model using this command, so SAM deploy guided, it's actually a wrapper or an abstraction on top of CloudFormation. So CloudFormation is our declarative infrastructure definition service in AWS. So whenever we do a SAM deploy guided, it's actually going to make a request to CloudFormation and provide information to create a CloudFormation template, which is going to deploy a stack. A stack is a mechanism to organize services or resources per application. So let's take a look at some of the stuff here. So let's scroll down. So we have a handful of different resources that are going to get created. So we have application insights, so that's for our telemetry. Resource group, that's to manage all the resources in once. So an IAM role here for that. We have Lambda permission, our Lambda function here. And then our DynamoDB table and our API gateways. So at the end of the day, we're going to deploy all these services and create all these services and then deploy our code to it. So the next thing it's going to do is you want to deploy this change set. Let's go Y. And then it's going to start the process of actually creating that stack in CloudFormation. So this does take a little bit of time, so let's actually stop and come back when it's complete. All right, so we're back. Now let's take a look actually at what happened when SAM deploy -- guided actually completed. So as you can see, let's scroll up a little bit to the top, and this is where we left off when I had said deploy this change set. So it actually gives us a running log of all of the different activities that need to take place in CloudFormation to get our serverless application up and running. So as you can see here, we have some create in progress, some create completes, some more create in progress, so creating the Lambda, the DynamoDB, the API gateway. And then finally at the bottom, it shows the CloudFormation outputs from the deployed stack. So in this particular case, it's this endpoint. So if I click on this here, let me just bring this over. So this is just the default route, so the home route. So welcome to running ASP.NET Core Minimal API on AWS Lambda. That's really cool. Let's actually do this. Let's take a look at the AWS console and see what it looks like from the AWS console perspective when we deploy a serverless application using the SAM CLI. So I'm here, I'm in US West, US West 2, which is in Oregon. If I click on CloudFormation here, this is going to route me to all of the stacks that I have deployed in this particular region. And the .NET SAM API is the stack that I created. And if you take a look here, it says create complete, obviously, and then we can take a look at the events, which is, again, looks like that log from we saw in the output of the command line. And then we have our resources here. So we have our application insights monitoring. We have our service, which is an AWS Lambda we can go and take a look at. Let's just open that up in a second. And then we have our AM role. We can view that sample table that we had talked about, and then finally that API gateway. So let's actually open these up and go through them one by one. Let's take a look at the Lambda function. So as you can see here, it's just a Lambda function with an API gateway trigger. We can actually monitor that because we configured X-Ray and CloudWatch on there. So we can take a look at some of the requests that come in, different logs, traces, and all that sort of stuff. And as well as look at a service map of the route of all the different requests that go across the service. So that's really cool. If we go over to our table here, we actually see that we have a data table. So we have a .NET SAM API book catalog. And right now, if I take a look at explore table items, there's nothing in here because it's just a sample table. We can actually, let's come back and insert some records here in a second. And then finally, we have that API gateway that I talked about. So that API gateway has a particular route to it. So whenever somebody makes requests to this particular API gateway, it's going to route them directly to Lambda. We can actually take a look at this API gateway here, and let's just open up. Wrong one. I clicked on the wrong one, sorry. So .NET SAM API. And we can actually take a look at the routes here. So the routes that exist, so for proxy, so any, this is going to route us to this particular integration. We can actually take a look at these integrations here and scrolling down. So it's, as you can see, it goes to the .NET SAM API. So basically any of the proxy routes. So remember that we have an endpoint of API/books. So like, for instance, I could go back. Let's actually do this. Where was that endpoint? It was in the command line. Let's go back to the command line. So if I go here, open this up, and if I go API/books, it's going to return an empty result. And this is actually this is data coming back from the DynamoDB table. So we can actually go in here and let's actually just create some items in here. So the first one, so let's create, this is an empty value. So this is going to be a GUID. Let me just generate a new GUID really quick. 1 second. I'm looking at a different page, looking at a GUID generator. So put that in here. And then we can actually add new attributes. So there's an attribute that's called title. And let's just call this, test book, because I can't think of a good book name, so I'm being pretty boring. So we can actually create this item here. And remember that if we take a look in here, so this is the representation of our table. So we have that GUID right here. So we have the ID, we have a string title, and then we can have some alternate things. We have ISBN and a list of authors and cover pages. So hopefully, if I didn't do anything wrong here, since I saved that to the table, let me just make sure that I actually saved it. So I have an ID with a title and a test book. So if I go here and click this, we have that. So I mean, not super exciting, but like, again, so I was able to create a record inside of DynamoDB using the AWS console, and that showed up immediately available via this API endpoint. And then I could do things like post and put and delete if I wanted to in the future. So here's an example. So here's something we should play around with too. And let's say that our book catalog, maybe it increases. Maybe we add new, I guess you could say, properties to that. And we can actually do that. And we can actually validate this in real time using the SAM CLI. So let's do this. So let's pull up here and let's go SAM. And this is sync. And then we're going to do a stack name. So basically, SAM sync, what it allows you to do is every time you make a coding change in your serverless application, it's going to redeploy that stack, not redeploy the stack, but redeploy that code base to AWS Lambda. So we have a stack name, and that was .NET SAM API. And then we can just add the watch command. So what this will actually do is this is actually going to spin up that mechanism that is basically watching. It's going to give us just a little warning here saying that you're synchronizing a development stack. So click yes. And then what we're going to happen is it's going to actually run a watching mechanism that not only watches on our code base, but infrastructure as well. So if we wanted to, say, for instance, add another DynamoDB table, or we wanted to add EventBridge or Amazon SQS or some of these other services, we could do that. So let's do this here. Let's pin this over here to this side. Let's do here, and let's take this out here, and then let's just do this. Let's add another property. So let's just call this add another property, and let's just call it, how about we call it release date? And just for simplicity's sake, I'm still going to leave it as a string. So as you can see, I click save, and then it proceeded to kick off a .NET build, a .NET publish. So it's actually publishing, zipping, all of those things. So it notices that we've updated our source hash. So remember, we talked about this a bit earlier, that every single time we run a SAM build, a hash is stored, and that hash is actually stored in that file, so it does a comparison. So what I should be able to do if I hop over to our endpoint here, hopefully, fingers crossed, this will actually include another property. So if I click that, as you can see here, boom, release date. So I didn't have to do the deployment manually. It was actually done through that SAM sync. And I could iterate on this a few ways. I could go into and set like a default for this if I wanted to have that actually be an actual date instead of a string. But I just want to show you that you can do the complete developer loop. So you can do testing locally, you can do deployment, you can do testing in real time against a service that's out in AWS. So really cool stuff. What else can we show? How about this? So we were in the command line. I just stopped let's just terminate this batch here. Let's terminate that job that's running. So we've been in the command line, and we've also been in VS Code at the same time. So what if I didn't want to be in both at the same time? Maybe I just want to do all this inside of VS Code. So if I have the AWS toolkit right here, so if I have the AWS toolkit for VS Code setup, I can take a look. Let's just minimize this, and I can look in. Let me just minimize some of these. So we're in Oregon. So as you can see, I have an API. I have an AWS Lambda, sorry, not API gateway, so .NET SAM API. And so what I want to do is I want to have a similar experience to what I was doing in the command line, but not have to leave VS Code. So what I can actually do is I can, if I go into the server or the file explorer, and I scroll down to template.yaml and right click, because I have the AWS Toolkit for Visual Studio Code, I have access to sync SAM application. So if I click sync here, I then provide the information about my region, I provide my stack, and then I provide the bucket where the bits get put. And then what it's going to do is it's actually going to set up a deployment. So for instance, I can make some coding changes and then run that really quick, and then it would do a deploy. So let's actually validate that. So this is going to do this really quick, but when we do, we're going to do it one more time, and then we're going to make sure that that works. So it's queuing up that, finish syncing, so we're all done. So let's do this. So let's just say I don't want this property anymore. So I can actually delete that, and then I can actually access that SAM sync via the command palette as well in VS Code. So I can do that, sync SAM application, and then provide those steps again, select the SAM, select a SAM template, which because I didn't actually right click on it, I have to specify the SAM template, provide that, provide the bucket, and then that's going to kick off that command line operation behind the scenes to actually do that deployment. So I don't have to actually leave VS Code to do some of these things, which is really exciting. And this is going to do that same thing as earlier. It's going to run that build, it's going to run that publish, it's going to zip up those files, and then it's going to deploy them out to that AWS Lambda. So if I hop back over, fingers crossed, here, well, if I refresh this a few times, the release date goes away. So again, the two different options. So I can do things inside the CLI completely inside the command line using the SAM CLI, or I can use the AWS toolkit for VS Code to do some of those operations as well. And there you have it. Starting off at creating a serverless application using the SAM CLI, testing it locally, building it, and then eventually deploying it to AWS Cloud. Really great stuff. I hope you're liking the content here. Be sure to like, subscribe, follow. Let me know what other sort of content you want to see. I want to make sure that you are building all sorts of amazing stuff on AWS with .NET. So that's it. I'm Isaac Levin, and this has been another episode of AWS for the non-developer. Take care.